and welcome back for another Share Custodian video. You know, it wasn't that long ago that the US News and World Report rankings were the agreed upon arbiter of prestige and quality in medical schools. It doesn't mean we all agreed with them. I mean, some people might have quibbled with their results or their methodology, but somehow, at the end of the day, everyone begrudgingly conceded that only US News and World Report could decide, only US News and World Report could tell us which schools were better than others. But a lot's changed over the past couple of weeks. Starting with Harvard, the majority of the top 20 medical schools, according to US News, have announced that they're pulling out. They're no longer going to contribute their data to the US News rankings. This mass exodus raises lots of questions. Questions about what it means for the schools that left, the schools that stayed, the longevity of the US News and World Report rankings, and the ecosystem of medical admissions at large. And you know what that means. Yeah, that's right. It's time to break it down, winners and losers style. Our first winner, the Medical Ivy League. If you want to know why these schools are leaving, they've all released public statements that catalog their numerous, and to be fair, legitimate reasons for departing the US News rankings. But make no mistake, this is ultimately a strategic decision for each of them. Look, staying on top of the US News rankings is difficult. It requires ongoing and careful attention to the US News ranking formula and strategic decisions about how you're going to maximize your performance in each dimension that they're ranking on. For medical school deans, this whole process is expensive and tiresome. Beyond that, what do the most prestigious medical schools have to gain by helping US News rank them? I mean, not much. If the average person already believes that, for sake of example, Stanford is a better medical school than the University of Pittsburgh, well, why would you provide data to US News that could be used to change people's minds? Why not just call game and immortalize your top 20 ranking? And that's why, one after another, the medical Ivies have decided that playing the US News and World Report game, it just isn't worth it for them. They're taking their ball and they're going home. And that brings us to our first loser, the NYU Grossman School of Medicine. Because no school has risen faster in the US News and World Report rankings than NYU. Back when I applied to medical school, which doesn't feel like it was that long ago, NYU was a solid top 50 school. But last year, according to US News, it was the number 2 school in the country. And even if you have just a passing familiarity with NYU, you know that this isn't by accident. Their meteoric rise through the US News and World Rankings coincides with dramatic structural improvements to the school, fueled by a massive influx of cash. So much cash that the school for several years now has been tuition free for all the students who go there. The students who go to NYU have an average MCAT score of 522 and an average undergraduate GPA of 3.96, which are the highest in the country. So there are pundits who believed that all it would take is a little tweak to the US News formula to prioritize those statistics, and they could have taken the number 1 ranking from Harvard. And they may still seize the top spot, but that victory is not going to be as sweet if the schools that they wanted to beat say they're not playing anymore. Our next loser, US News and World Report. So quick question for you. When was the last time that you looked to US News and World Report for news or reporting on anything other than rankings? Yeah, I can't remember either. The magazine's transformation from being the nation's 3rd favorite print news magazine to being this kingmaker of academics is best chronicled by Malcolm Gladwell. And I'm going to link to a couple of his podcasts on this topic in the show notes. But suffice to say that these days, the entire US News business is built around ranking one thing or another. They have successfully monetized almost everything around the rankings. So if you're an applicant, you want to see the full data in the rankings, you can, but it'll cost you $29.95. Let's say you work for a school and you need more detailed data for advanced visualizations or historical trending or maybe benchmarking against your peer institutions, cough, cough, ways to game the system. Well, you can get it, but that's going to cost you even more. You want to advertise to potential students on the US News and World Rankings, put your school's emblem right in front of the people who are looking at it at that time. You can, but that's going to cost you. Or, maybe you just want to slap the US News and World Report Best Medical Schools badge on your own website. You can do that too. But yeah, you guessed it, it's going to cost you. Their whole business model is built around our collective acceptance of their modeling being legitimate. And now, the more people who stop paying attention to their rankings, the more it's going to hurt their bottom line. And that brings us to our next winner, rankings entrepreneurs. Because look, even if US News disappeared completely, which they're not, but even if they did, they would just be replaced by some other ranking system. Folks, we have an insatiable desire to rank things. The medical Ivies can withhold their data, but they can't keep people from having an opinion. We're trying to make a buck. So there's going to be room in this space now for rankings entrepreneurs, but any startup's going to have to compete with the old boss because, like I said, U.S. News is not going anywhere. They may lose some of their legitimacy, but they're just going to reconfigure their formula so they can exclusively use data acquired from public sources, and they're going to carry on as usual. And as an aside, don't you think for a minute that this fact didn't occur to the medical Ivies that were leading the U.S. News exodus? I mean, one thing you got to remember is that the US News rankings, they thrive on their perceived legitimacy. And so that means that whatever methodology they use, at the end of the day, it has to generate a list that looks something like what the rankings that people expect, or otherwise they lose legitimacy. So these schools that are leaving, they're still going to be at or near the top of the new US News and World Report rankings, even without the schools contributing any data. But better yet, if they do slide a little bit, now the schools that have left, they've got a ready defense. They can say, they can remove their monocle and say, U.S. News, pah, we don't even submit data to them anymore. Our next loser, educational consultants. Many medical schools pay 5 and 6 figure fees to external consultants who analyze the US News algorithm and they recommend strategies that the school can use to maximize their ranking. And if you want to know how much your school might spend on this, if you go to a public school, I would highly encourage you to submit a Freedom of Information Act request and get the figure for yourself. My guess is that these educational consultants, they're not going anywhere. This is big business, and they're just going to pivot even harder into consulting to help your school support its LCME or COCA accreditation or to improve their diversity, equity, and inclusion metrics. These consultants, they're just going to have to shift their business. Our next winner, Campbell's Law. Whether you think it's a good thing that these schools are pulling out or a bad thing, I promise this much is true. Whatever variables that US News or their upstart competitors chooses to use in the next generation of school rankings, I promise that many schools are going to chase it. If you're unfamiliar with Campbell's Law, it states the more that any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision making, the more subject it becomes to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes that it is intended to monitor. And when you're talking about medical school rankings, Campbell's Law isn't just a winner, it's friggin' undefeated. All that we can hope is that whatever new ranking system we get, it will lead to less pernicious metric chasing than what we've had with US News and World Report. Our next loser, the MCAT. Although US News has decreased its mathematical impact over the past several years, historically, one of the most impactful variables in the US News formula has been the MCAT scores of its entering students. Now, if you're like me, it may strike you as a bit of a curious analytic decision to weight MCAT scores so heavily if you're trying to figure out what are the best medical schools. Because recall, of course, that students take the MCAT before they go to medical school. So what do we think that performance on a test that students take before they come to your school tells us anything about the quality of the education that they receive after they've gone to your school? In reality, of course, the reason that US News chose to weight the MCAT so heavily is because it helped their rankings maintain face validity. It helped them keep a thumb on the scale so that the rankings formula generated the expected order of results. You come up with a ranking system that says that Howard or Eastern Virginia Medical School or Medical College of Georgia is the best medical school in the country. Ain't nobody going to pay attention to that ranking. You need to have the schools that people expect, maybe a couple of surprises, but the schools that people expect at the top of those rankings. The same function, of course, is performed by the U.S. News reputation score, where they survey deans at other schools and ask, well, what do you think are the best schools in the country? And of course, realistically, the deans don't have any idea about what fundamentally is going on at any schools other than their own, or maybe a handful of others. Their main source of information on the best schools is, of course, the previous year's U.S. News and World Report rankings. So it sets up this big circular logic tautology that somehow we've all chosen to accept, where if you ask US News, what are the best medical schools? They say, well, they're the medical schools that people think are the best medical schools. And why, US News, do they think that they're the best medical schools? Why? Because we said they were the best medical schools. But back to the MCAT, the point is that the primacy of the MCAT in the U.S. News and World Report rankings, it stabilized the primacy of the MCAT in medical school admissions. And don't get me wrong here. I mean, the MCAT tells you something about a student's readiness for medical school. If you look at MCAT performance, you can see that the variations in MCAT performance explain about 33% of the variations in academic performance over the first 2 years of medical school. But the fact that a low MCAT score identifies a student who's likely to struggle in medical school doesn't necessarily mean that a person who's got a 95th percentile score is definitely going to be a better doctor than somebody with a 90th percentile score or something similar. And yet, we're providing an incentive to schools to interpret MCAT scores in that way. And now, without the US News and World Report rankings being quite as powerful, schools will be able to interpret MCAT scores in a way that's a little bit more in line with their actual predictive validity. And if you're interested in looking at some of the primary literature that shows the association between MCAT scores and medical school performance, I'll link to some of the relevant articles in the show notes. Next up, honesty. And I'm not sure if this is a winner or a loser. We're going to call this a push. It's well known that schools sometimes get a little loosey-goosey with the data that they submit to US News. The best example recently is Columbia. They're in the undergraduate rankings. They were ranked number 2 until it was found that the data that they submitted couldn't be verified, and they got demoted in the U.S. News rankings. I've also highlighted how medical schools tend to fudge the number of their graduates that go into primary care fields because that's an important component of the U.S. News primary care medical schools rankings. And there's a number of schools that have been removed from the rankings for fudging those figures. But whether the depreciation of the U.S. News rankings is going to be an overall victory for honesty, I think that's still unclear because most of the departing schools have announced that they're going to put detailed information for medical school applicants on their own web pages. But whether that data is going to be in a standardized form that allows an apples to apples comparison or just enables more number fudging, I think that has yet to be seen. Our next winner, the U.S. News and World Report Best Hospitals ranking. Many of the institutions that dropped out of the medical school rankings, they've been careful to note that they are not dropping out of the best hospitals rankings. And sometimes their spokespersons, they try to draw a bright line between the, bad methodology med school rankings and the completely valid hospital rankings and say that the hospital rankings they use this defensible patient-centered methodology and they provide a valuable service to patients and families. Let me be on the record as saying that I'm skeptical. I'm very skeptical that the best hospitals multivariable adjustments and tortured regression models provide any more meaningful insight than the educational rankings do. Maybe it's just that hospital administrators have more stamina for metric chasing than the deans. In reality, I think that's not the answer either. I think that the payoffs for winning in the best hospital rankings are just higher. Because if you think about it, Harvard Medical School, whether they're number 1 or number 50, they're only taking about 100 students who are going to pay tuition each year. On the other hand, if you're a best hospital, if you can shift just a few patients who need expensive surgeries or complex transplant care or oncology care or cardiac care, you switch just a few of those patients from one hospital to your best hospital, well, you can pay for a whole lot of metric chasing. Our next winner, the OGs. I'm not honestly sure how important of a historical moment this is. It might be that in a few years all of this is forgotten, or it might be that we look at this as being sort of a turning point in the way that we look at these rankings. But to whatever extent future generations remember this moment in history, I think it will be recalled that Harvard was the leader, the first domino to fall, the Spartacus that broke all the other medical schools out of the U.S. news chains. And sure, Harvard was the first school to pull out in this final cascade, but they are far from being the first school to conscientiously object to the U.S. News rankings. Back in 2016, the deans at the Uniformed Services University, the school that trains our military physicians, they pulled their school out of the rankings, citing the perverse incentives and the flawed methodology that ran at cross purposes with the missions that they were trying to accomplish educationally. Um, Many osteopathic medical schools have never participated in the U.S. News rankings. Many of the historically black college and university affiliated schools, they know the deck is stacked against them, and they've declined to return the U.S. News survey in recent years as well. So all of these OGs, they can celebrate being on the right side of history, even if history doesn't quite remember their contributions. And now our last winner, medical school missions. Here I've got to ask, do we really believe that all medical schools are in some giant competition, all running in the same direction, competing with each other to be the best? Or is it more accurate that medical schools serve different populations and they meet different societal needs and they have different aspirations? Unfortunately, the primacy of the US News rankings makes it harder for schools to pursue missions that don't get captured by the metrics that are in their ranking formula. So maybe now schools will have a little more breathing room to pursue goals in physician training that can't easily be reduced to a single number. And maybe, just maybe, if they do, their graduates' future patients will win too. And that's about all I've got to say about the U.S. News and World Report mass exodus. Thanks for listening.